Hi, I'm Selena from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester, and I'm here with Chris Panatiere, who is a speculative fiction author. And I'm going to let you tell people what it is that you write, Chris.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Selena. And we met each other at Boscone. That was very cool and very fortuitous. So, what do I write? Well, I write a. I've been doing it. I should be able to describe it. I try to write fiction that has an element of wonder to it, and that sort of crosses all the various genres I've written in. I've written in sci-fi, fantasy, and most recently I'm really doing a lot of horror writing. So, yeah,
Okay, so you've written science fiction and horror, and you've written short stories as well as novels,
that's right.
right?
Yes.
So, what can people expect? Why don't you tell us a little bit about the novels that you've written?
Sure. Well, my first, I have actually have them here. My debut novel came out in 2020. It's this hot pink guy right here. This is called The Phlebotomist. And this is a near future science fiction, but also horror adjacent um, novel about, like I said, near future. The main character is a grandmother who works for the governmental contractor charged with collecting the harvest, which is blood. And this is about a society segregated by blood type. And that's all I'll say about it because the rest would be spoilers. And then
Wow.
2 years later in 2022, I wrote this book called Stringers.
Mhm.
Stringers is it's a space opera. It's a found family sort of story where stringers are people who have a strange and unexplained access to consciousnesses that aren't necessarily theirs. And it turns out that that is a very, very valuable thing. And there are bounty hunters and folks throughout the rest of the universe who really, really want to collect stringers so they can mine their consciousnesses for treasure. So that's stringers. And this is a humorous sci-fi. It's very humorous. It's fairly crass. It got a nice starred review from Publishers Weekly. They compared it to Hitchhiker's Guide, which is a total double-edged sword because this is not the Hitchhiker's Guide, but it is space humor. And some people have read this wanting the Hitchhiker's Guide and they didn't get it and they were very mad. But if you're into humorous space adventure, this is a good book for you. And then my latest book that comes out in April of 2024, so in almost exactly 2 months, April 23rd, is called The Redemption of Morgan Bright. And this is a full-throated horror novel. This is I would call it a contemporary gothic with supernatural elements, but a lot of horror. And the sort of elevator pitch on this one is Morgan Bright. Her sister died while in the custody of an asylum, a modern asylum. They've come back in this, and no one has any answers for her. So she assumes a false identity and has herself committed to try to figure out what happened to her sister. And things go bad from there.
Ooh, interesting. So, what do you think draws readers to these kinds of books?
um, you know, no matter what type of story I'm writing, I can only really think about what draws me to a story, right?
Hmm.
And for me, there's really two big factors. One is, of course, hopefully memorable characters I really like. Um, and I think you have to have that to have a compelling story. And hopefully, those are the types of characters I'm writing. Readers may beg to differ, but that's what I'm trying to do. And then the other piece is that I always try to incorporate some sense of there is something bigger than what's on the page. And that's always walking a bit of a tightrope because I don't want to spell everything out for readers. And I don't want it spelled out for me as a reader
Hmm.
necessarily. But the tightrope is I want to have a sense that there is something wondrous, something bigger. There's a bigger mystery. But I also want to know that the author knows what it is, meaning that I don't want to read a book where the author just threw a bunch of stuff on the page. At times it can seem cool or intriguing or whatever, but there really isn't any there. And even if it's not explained to me as the reader, I want to know that the author knows that there is a cohesive theory as to what's going on here. At the same time, I don't want them to necessarily tell me every nut and bolt about what it is, because wonder
Hmm.
is sort of in the mystery. And so even if I'm telling a story that is fairly intimate, but there's a supernatural element or a big sci-fi element to it, I kind of want to leave a little bit to the imagination and not spell too much of it out. So that really is a common thread with everything I've written so far, that there tends to be almost always there's something working in the background. And before we came on here, I mentioned The Expanse to you. And I think The Expanse is actually a great example. Now that's science fiction, very clearly. In a lot of ways, it's very hard science fiction.
Hmm.
But then throughout the entire series, this is 9 books, throughout the entire series, there is something working in the background. It's in the distance and it's hinted at and fainted at, and it's there. And it's that mystery that is so propulsive that makes you keep turning the pages, even as you're dealing with these smaller conflicts between the characters and the different factions and all this. There's something much bigger than them working in the background. And there's even something bigger than that thing that's working in the background. And I just love that about stories. So that's what really attracts me to stories. I don't think you always have to have that big thing. I think that extremely compelling stories can be told in a very intimate way without an outside world. But for me, the biggest draw is where there's maybe something else going on and we don't quite
Hmm.
have the full picture of it. I just love that.
So you really like mysteries.
I do, even if it's not, who did it? Was it the
Yeah.
butler, with the wrench?
Yeah. Right.
I do like a mystery, whether that shows itself in horror or in science fiction or fantasy. I like a question that propels you through the pages.
Hmm. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, what was the inspiration for the redemption of Morgan Bright?
That okay, so the very first inspiration, the seed, this is so funny. The seed of this was at the time when I came up with this idea, my daughter was 5 years old and she didn't know Star Wars yet. And we were driving down the road and it was around Christmas time and someone had, how like yard ornaments are just getting bigger and bigger, right? Someone had a giant inflatable Darth Vader. This thing had to be 20 feet tall with a candy cane lightsaber. Okay. Now, my daughter has no idea who Darth Vader is at this point. And sometimes the words kids put together can be incredibly compelling, very haunting. And here's what she said. She said, "Oh, look, it's the Christmas witch." And I was like, those two words together are so loaded. I just love that idea. And I was like, that sounds like the title of a book, The Christmas Witch, right? I have to figure out what this story is and I have to write it. So I started, this is about 4 or 5 years ago. I just started writing a story where I was like, Christmas witch. How do I tell a story of a Christmas witch? I was like, maybe it's an old asylum story from the 1800s or something. And I started to research asylums and I came up with an extremely loose idea. And then I kind of set it aside and I wrote Stringers. That kind of came next. And then Stringers was done and I was working on some other books that have gone on sub, and I was trying to think of what to do next. And right about that time, I kind of knew I was going to do an asylum story. I had done enough research by then to know that I thought I was going to do one where the protagonist has themselves committed under false pretenses, which is a little bit of a retelling of the story of Nellie Bly, who, for anyone watching or listening, Nellie Bly was a 23-year-old journalist. This is 1893 in New York State. And at the time, the conditions of patients in the state's mental institutions was coming under scrutiny because of all the mistreatment and everything. And Nellie Bly, at 23 years old, a woman in 1893, convinces her editor to let her go undercover and assume a false identity, which the false identity I believe was Nellie Brown, or Natalie Brown, I think. And she goes in to this asylum, has herself committed. As soon as she goes inside, she starts acting completely normal. Okay, and she's just after 10 days, she says, "Okay, I'm not really mentally ill. Let me out." And they go, "No, you are positively demented." And they tried to keep her there, and her editor had to come and get her out. And she wrote a book afterwards called 10 Days in a Madhouse, which is public domain. You can read it. And so by then I had learned about Nellie Bly. But then another thing happened around the time I was thinking about starting this, and that is Roe versus Wade was overturned. And I am pretty much an unapologetic feminist. I always have been. And of course, it's not just because I have a daughter now, but I do. And I live in Texas, which
Oh,
which is not going in a very good direction. I couldn't write this story without that impacting the direction of it. So in some ways, I don't believe in necessarily beating people over the head with a political message because I think it pulls you out of the story. But in some ways, it is a very general oblique response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade.
interesting.
As far as kind of where my head was at, but it's a completely standalone story. You don't need to know any of that to enjoy the story. But it goes very hard, and in a lot of ways, there's a lot of frustration and anger behind the story, because of what is happening to people.
Your frustration.
Yes. Yeah.
Hmm. So you were talking about research that you did. You must have done a lot of research. How long did it take you?
So I am a total pantser. And so once my pantser, meaning writing from the seat of my pants, don't outline a lot. Although I've gotten myself into trouble and then had to like stop and go, okay, I need to outline the rest of this because it's just spinning out of control. Um, in this case, I had the central idea. So I started writing, and I didn't know, I just started writing and I was like, I'm going to fill in the blanks as I need. And so I started to write in general terms, kind of painting a very vague picture of this asylum, the treatments, and all of that. And then as I was doing it, I really dove in and started researching. And the main treatise for me that I read is a book called Mad Wives, by Carol Warren, and I actually mention it in my Mad Wives, Schizophrenic Women in the 1950s is the full title, by Carol Warren. And that book it's actually a scientific study, um, covering, I think, 15 or 20 women in a mental institution in California in the 1950s. And not only what the treatments are, but specifics in following this group of women. And the 1950s was really the era I kind of wanted to evoke in this book. I didn't want to go all the way back to just the most brutal sort of settings in physical and oppression terms. I wanted to do something a little bit more subtle because I think that if there's something to address now. And this is a contemporary book, so I don't put a date on it. You cannot figure out the date of when this is happening, um, just by reading it, but it is contemporary slash near future because that's kind of where we are right now. But I wanted to resurrect a little bit about what was going on in the 1950s. It's got some comparisons so far to Handmaiden's Tale, um, but it's not that. But it's sort of like taking a past situation and or Handmaid's Tale, sorry, and putting it into the future. I'm just based on what we're looking at, and so I did focus on the 1950s. In addition to Carol Warren's book, YouTube is an amazing, amazing resource because on YouTube, there are countless actual clinical interviews of institutionalized women in the 1950s, in not just here in the States, but there's a lot out of France. And the same thing kind of was happening there too with this. There was this trend of really overdiagnosing women with schizophrenia. And they just called it schizophrenia. Um, and it was what I learned from this research, from those interviews, from Warren's book, and a lot of other. There's a lot of other documentation, some papers and things I read. None of this was like delineated as to how do you actually go through and make a legitimate diagnosis. It was kind of it because I did try to, when I first started writing this, I did try to set out and go, okay, well, what are the diagnostic terms that
Mm-hmm.
that would be applied here? And of course, during that period, there really weren't any being uniformly applied. A lot of it was experimentation on the treaters, from the treaters' point of view. Some of it was, I believe a lot of it actually was meant, they were trying to do good and not doing good. And then there were some who I think were simply using women as guinea pigs. I mean, that was happening. And so what I realized was, if this sort of attitude were to make a comeback, it wouldn't be to the advantage of the treaters or the oppressors to have a specifically delineated diagnostic criteria. It's to their advantage to not have a specific
Right.
diagnostic criteria. And so in The Redemption of Morgan Bright, I conjured up a new diagnosis that, of course, has echoes of what we've seen in the past. And in this book, it's called domestic psychosis, is what it is. And so you have women being just overdiagnosed by with domestic psychosis. And one other thing that is resurrected in this book is the ability of a husband to have his wife committed for any reason necessary, because of course that was a real thing. And I will say it's very interesting, the perspectives I got from some of my male readers and some of my female readers. There were male readers who read this and told me that it didn't seem realistic because women's rights had come so far. I didn't get that from the women. the the in my point, and in fact, I have a little in an afterword, I actually bring up the fact that just because rights have come a long way doesn't mean they never get pushed back, and we're seeing that right now in
For
so many
sure.
ways. And to be very clear, it's not just against women, it's against lots of groups, but I focused on women. And I think it's extremely important that we have some reminders in fiction, and then we see these and we go, okay, no, we don't want to go there. But yeah, there were several states in the United States that, as of the middle of the 1800s, a husband could just have his wife committed and she's gone, and he can go get remarried, get rid of the problem. And so I resurrected that law for this book, and it takes place in the state of Nebraska. So that's where it's set.
Wow. That's scary. That's
Yeah,
very
sorry,
scary.
that was a very long answer, so sorry.
Yeah, no, it's it it does give a lot about the a lot of information about about the book.
Yeah,
Whoosh.
yeah, yeah.
So, what was the biggest challenge that you had in writing and putting out the book?
This one is extremely, extremely layered, and there's a lot going on. Um, I I have yet, well, maybe the phlebotomist, but even the phlebotomist has some twists and turns. I just can't write a straight ahead from A to Z story. I just can't do it. Maybe someday, maybe in some of my flash stories, I kind of can in 1,000 words. But you give me a novel, and you're gonna get a lot of layers and a lot of twists and turns. And so the hardest part was, I have some dueling POVs, and it's basically on the jacket copy that two of the POVs are in the same person. And
Hmm.
they basically the and this is on the cover copy, so it's no spoilers, but Morgan um, has herself identified falsely as uh, a troubled housewife named Charlotte Turner, and that's how she fakes her way into this institution. So there's Morgan Bright behaving as Charlotte Turner, and there's something going on at Hollyhock that sort of brings Charlotte to life. And so Charlotte, the false identity, and Morgan Bright, the true identity, find themselves at war with each other. And
Ooh.
so that was a challenge to keep those voices separate. And there are other chapters that are text messages between Morgan Bright and her sister Hadley, who's the sister that had died. So I'm giving you these text messages throughout the story. And then there are transcript sections of the aftermath of this big event, which happened at Hollyhock, that you don't get to know about until further in, between Morgan and the police. But it might not be Morgan who's talking to the police. It might be Charlotte. So, so there was a lot of layering. And to come back to sort of my original point, there is a story. It does tie up. It does all come together and make sense. This isn't the author throwing stuff, but if you kind of have to be a diligent reader, this is not a sit down in the afternoon and just breeze through it book. I am extremely inspired by people like Catriona Ward, who wrote The Last House on Needless Street, Sundial, um, Looking Glass Sound, and her work takes work to put together, but it is some of the most mind-blowing, amazing stuff I've ever read, and I absolutely love it. And so I think that I'm wired in a similar way. And so to answer your question directly, once I had it all laid out, at the end, I actually made an outline of all the chapters and whether they were a text chapter, a transcript chapter, or a prose chapter. And then I also have some sections of Morgan's research before she has herself committed to this place, where she's researched it. So there are newspaper articles, there's old interviews, there's some pictures, and that's all woven in there as well. And I made this outline of all those sections, and I had to make sure that they were laid out in exactly the right way to give the reader just enough of the story to keep turning the pages to get to the conclusion. So that was probably the most difficult part, is I had so much going on, having to really organize it, even though I pantsed the book, even though
Hmm.
I just sprinted through it, and I wrote, probably the first draft was written in 3 months. But then
Wow.
it took a solid 7 or 8 months to really refine it and get it exactly as I wanted to tell it, layered like an onion. I mean, so delicately, to bring you to the finish.
Wow.
Yeah.
That sounds really, it sounds like it was really tough to figure out which section to put
Yeah.
where.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Ooh, okay. Was there one particular character that you loved or hated the most?
There's a lot of characters to hate in this book. But
It
I
sounds
think
like it.
there are. There is a character named Christmas. So to bring it back to my daughter's original thing, there is a woman in the institution named Christmas, and some of the other women like to spread rumors that she is a witch, the Christmas witch.
Mhm.
That is the remaining little nugget of what my daughter had said 5 years ago. But Christmas is a very interesting character in that she seems like she's just sort of there. Like maybe she's got a diagnosis, maybe she doesn't. She also suffers from um, St. Vitus's tick, which is generally in children only, but this is a grown woman. And St. Vitus's tick is one of the most unsettling things you'll ever see if you watch a video of it. And it's just where a person who suffers from it doesn't really have control of their limbs. And so they just float and they just sort of move around. And she's got this affliction as an adult, which is very uncommon. And she is a bit of I'll just say she's a bit of a medium in some ways.
Mm.
And so she was a very interesting character to write. She's not on the page a whole lot, but when she shows up, stuff happens. Just put it that way. So she was a lot of fun to write, and also I got to write a character that on the surface was not particularly, because of what she does, she's not particularly one you empathize with, but you do empathize with her whole story. So I like writing characters that don't come to you in a nice package that you don't initially love. But as you understand their plight and their story, you begin to ally yourself with them. So I had a lot of fun writing her. She was tough to write, but I enjoyed writing her, and I've never written a character like her before. So I would say Christmas.
Hmm. So, do you come up with the characters as you're writing the story or before? Or
I
how do you come up with the characters?
That's such a good question because it's almost a similar question to outlining versus pantsing,
Hmm.
because I do know a lot of writers, a lot of successful writers. I have friends who do entire character sketches beforehand and everything, and I don't. What I do is my character sketch is my first draft, really. By the time I finish the first draft, I go, okay, I know who the characters are now. And the revision, my first revision, is where I backfill and I flesh those characters out. Now that I know who they are by the end of the story, then I build them up. I go back and build them up. Um, for me, I generally I'm kind of a plot first person. So I plot, but I don't neglect character, but I plot first, and then as I'm kind of going along and I'm pantsing and I'm writing, and the characters are gaining, I don't know, sentience, sort of, I guess. And they start to make more decisions. I learn more about them, and I can go back and I can go, well, were the decisions I had them making earlier consistent with who I think they are now? And it's a lot of back and forth and turning dials to get it to work right. But to answer your question, I let the characters sort of come to me as I'm writing the story, and then I flesh them out in those subsequent drafts.
Hmm. Do the characters sometimes tell you where the story's going?
Uh, More often than they don't,
Okay.
probably. You
Yeah.
know, when I start, I generally know how it's going to end, generally. And usually for me, it's very interesting. Usually I have an image of the ending in my head. And most often we get that image in the story, but I might have one or two more beats after it to make it fit with the characters and where they're headed. Um, but yeah, the characters really do kind of control their own destinies. And I have to make sure that, people can make more than one decision or more than one choice. And I have to make sure the choices they make keep me generally on that arc towards where the story needs to go. But I don't, if they need to make a decision and the decision is really clear, then I need to solve the problem on the plot end and make that work, because sometimes a character only does have one choice, and you lose all credibility if you take them out of who they are just to serve your plot. So yeah.
Okay. What else can we expect from you in the near future?
Well, I have I have I'm in probably my third or fourth revision on a new horror novel, that I would describe as a cross between A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay and Little Orphan Annie. And it is a haunted house book, and that's really all I can say about it right now. We're probably going to go on submission with it this spring, and hopefully someone wants to buy it. I came up with this idea during a panel at StokerCon last year on tropes, and I thought to myself, I wonder if anyone has ever told a story where there's a haunted house, but it's a good haunted house. It's good. And the family inside it is good. And how can I make that all go really, really bad?
Hmm.
In what
Interesting.
way? How can I make that happen? So that's what I started with, and that's what I ended up writing. And it's certainly nothing like I've read before, but it does have some elements of Head Full of Ghosts, and it does, of course, deal with a foster child that's in the house. And I'm very curious. There are some different points of view. There's the adopted or the foster child who's 12. There's another child in the house who's I'm deciding whether she's 8 or 9. But I really, really want to read Josh Mallerman's next book, Incidents Around the House, which apparently is like amazingly frightening, very scary. It comes out, I think, in July. And it's all told from the perspective of an 8-year-old child. So I'm curious to see, once I read that, I'm curious to see if that's going to be a comp for this book. But I don't know yet. So anyway, that is probably going to go on sub this spring. And that book is called Worry Box, is what it's called right now. And then I have a novella that I'm finishing up, which is sort of a Texas flavored Halloween season, 1980s pulpy horror movie feel, fun, a lot of fun, about uh, a ghost carnival, basically. Just call it that.
Okay.
That is trying to become real again, and that's just a novella. And and then I have some short stories that I'm subbing to some anthologies right now, and I'm always writing flash fiction. So yeah, so once I finish Worry Box and set that down, I'll be thinking about what the next novel is going to be. And right now, I'm thinking about maybe novelizing one of my short stories, but I'm not quite sure yet.
Uh-huh.
Lots of
Okay.
cons this year, though. I'm going to
Yeah.
so many cons and so many book festivals because I really want Morgan Bright to land the right way. It's my first, all the way horror novel. And so I'm trying to do just absolutely everything I can to have it launch right. And my publisher, Angry Robot Books, they're fantastic and they do a whole lot. So we're just trying to do everything we can to make it a success.
That sounds great.
Yeah.
You were talking about points of view, and that got me wondering about how do you determine the points of view of your character, of your books? How do you do that?
That's another tremendous question. And for me, that really learning that happened with my first novel with the phlebotomist. That one is third person limited omniscient. It's told from the perspective almost entirely of Willa Wallace, who is the main character. And but the manuscript I sent to my publisher, it had one chapter where there was one other point of view. And my editor said, look, that's a little jarring. We either need to get rid of it. She goes, I like it. She was like, I like it, but we either need to get rid of it or you need to bring more of his POV in throughout the story. And so I was like, well, I don't want to get rid of it because I do like that. So that was sort of a true trial by fire, I'd never done it before. The
Mhm.
Phlebotomist was maybe my third novel, but first published. And I hadn't done it prior to that. So it was a real sort of blunt force, like trial by fire of going back through the previous chapters and saying, well, could this chapter be a chapter of this character now? Could I change this to his perspective? And I did. I did that in several chapters and it really worked out. And I really loved it. And I loved telling the story. And of course, in some ways, multiple POVs is a cheat because it allows you to show things that the main character doesn't know, right?
Yeah.
If you only have either a first person or a third person limited sort of book, there's a boundary to what that person can know. But boy, other POVs takes care of that problem. And one of the reasons I really love it now, and in fact, one of the novels I've written that hopefully someday we'll see published, has 6 or 7 POVs.
Hmm.
And to answer your question, I only include a POV if it feels absolutely necessary, especially to tell a more sprawling story, a much bigger story.
Mhm.
Um, in the redemption of Morgan Bright, I told you there's 2 POVs
Mhm.
and that they're really the same person. Um, and it's telling each of how they experience Hollyhock House, which is the asylum. And you're getting these 2 divergent stories. And that's so much fun to play with on where does reality lie? Is it one or the other or a combination of both? Um, are they are both of them or neither or a little bit unreliable narrators? I really love that, and I love the work that makes the reader do. Um, but only if it's necessary for points of view. And that other book I wrote that has several, 6 or 7, they ended up all being necessary to tell the story as it needed to be told. Um, but every now and then, and I'm doing it with Worry Box right now that I'm writing, I have a POV for each family member. And as
Hmm.
I've gone through, I'm like, well, you know what? There are some chapters that I just don't need anymore. I don't think they add anything to the story. They probably slow it down a little bit, and I pop them right out. And boy, gee, I could still read it. It still all makes sense. And if you can do that, and it still all makes sense, and it doesn't slow the story down, then you probably don't need that chapter. But I did need, for many reasons, because Worry Box has a bit of a mystery in it as well. I needed to have the POVs of each of the family members so you could see what they were seeing and experience what they were experiencing as the
Hmm.
events unfold in this story. So you can judge for yourself who's in the right, who's doing what. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's the key is it's got to feel necessary. And if at the end and you're revising and one of those POVs doesn't feel necessary anymore, kill it off.
That's interesting because most books that I have read and have had just one point of view, and it seems really interesting to read a book that has several points of view.
Yeah,
It's very interesting.
I'll tell you, in some ways it's easier because you get to tell more of the story. In
Yeah,
some ways, of course, it's harder because you can do character from first person, you could do other characters, and you could do it from third person limited. But boy, when you're actually in somebody's head, you have to do a lot of work to make sure that you're really in a well-defined individual's head, that it feels different than those other POVs. So it does take some
exactly.
work.
Exactly. Because you have to make sure that the language is different from the others and um the way they speak and the excuse me, and the way they just communicate is totally different.
You make such a good point. When I started writing, and even outside of other POVs, but just having other characters, I made the mistake, and I'm sure every brand new writer makes this mistake of trying to distinguish them too much, and and you change how they talk and all of this, and it becomes a cartoon. And
That's true.
and you have to realize that the real most of the difference in characters is going to come from sort of their internal world or their actions, and you just have to suffuse each passage in each chapter with enough of that they feel distinct from another character. But boy, did I had some real caricatures in there when I first started writing. And, I'd write for a few months, I'd go back and read it and be like, this is a clown show. Like, what am I doing here? But that's how you learn, right?
Right. Okay, that's great. So, now I have questions about you about being a writer. What is your favorite part about being a writer on the whole writing and publishing process?
I think two things vie for top billing there. I think the first thing is the process of raw creation. That first draft. The first draft can be a beatdown because you're going to write things that just aren't very good. Um, but for me, on the whole, sitting down and creating something out of whole cloth is God, just an amazing feeling, and I love that. And sometimes I have to look. I'm human. I want other people to read my stuff. I want other people to like it. They may not, but I want them to like it and read it. And sometimes I have to remind myself, hey, Chris, like, regardless of whoever reads this, just the process of sitting down and building this, you love this. Remember that. Don't ever lose that. So that for me is the number one thing that I love most. I love creating something and it's new. It's never been seen before, right? That's amazing. What an amazing feeling that is. I love that. And then the second thing I love most is interacting with other readers and writers. And just, I can talk for hours and hours, like you and I are doing right now.
Yes.
I I love this sort of connection with people and talking with someone. They go, yeah, this and this, and you go, yes, I experienced the same thing, and it's a vital, amazing human connection, and that connection with readers when you've told a story, and then they've told the other half in their mind, they've seen it in their mind. That's magic. And I'm not the first to say that. Lots of people have said that, but that is so real, and I absolutely love that. And if I can have that for the rest of my life, I will take it. And so those two things, those are my favorite: creating and then sharing.
Okay. So, what do you consider the most challenging part of the whole writing process, and how do you overcome that?
Um, I still think the most challenging part is fighting those little nagging demons of is this any good, right? So you get so deep in something and you're so familiar with it and you know it word for word. Like the way when I search a manuscript and I go, oh, I got to fix this area, and I search a manuscript, I go, I'm pretty sure I used this word there, and I'll search and find that word, and there it'll be. So you know it so well that sometimes you don't see the forest for the trees. And that's why you need beta readers that are good and honest with you and don't just tell you how great it is. That doesn't help. That doesn't help because that can set you up for heartbreak later. And even though their intentions might be, um, because they love you. They want to protect you. They want you to be happy. Um,
Hmm.
a good, honest beta reader is everything. And on this current one I'm working on, I had several beta readers be very honest with me that in the first draft they read, which was probably my third draft, they were like, "Look, it's dragging in the beginning. You're there's a lot of info dumping here. I don't think you need it." My agent read it and gave me some very honest feedback about how it started. After that, after hearing from them, after hearing from my agent, I went back, I rewrote the whole thing.
Mm.
And it is, I believe, a much stronger book now. And I kind of can't believe that I sent them what I sent them, even though I thought it was in a good, right? I thought it was in a good place. But sometimes you can't just look in the mirror and go, "How is it, Chris? Is it good? Yeah, it's great." You need someone else to be your mirror, right? And so sometimes the hardest part is going, is this something that will keep people turning pages? Is this compelling? Is this a good story? Um, and I always have to remind myself, because I do art too. I paint, I draw, and I always have to remember when you're doing an oil painting, uh, like a portrait or something, and it's going to take many sittings, it goes through a super ugly phase. And you have to go, "Chris, you've done this before. You always get out of it. You will get through it," right? And writing is no different than oil painting. It's the exact same. It all goes through an ugly phase, and you've got to remind yourself that and just push through it and keep revising. And man, I'll tell you, the third or fourth revisions for me, sometimes the eighth or ninth revision, I'm like, "Oh my God, how did I not see this before?" And I love those little revelations. So the hardest part really is pushing through doubt.
Right. And okay, so what has been your favorite adventure during your writing career?
Um, so far, I have to say that it is, I'm very new as a writer still, relatively speaking. My debut was in 2020. And so I had never gone to any conventions at all. And again, this is kind of a second career for me. I started as an attorney. I did that for 2 decades, and I started writing late in that career. I still practice, but it's a little less now. And so I'd never been to conventions. I'd never been as a fan or anything. In fact, I even started, I hate to say this, but in a way, it was a little intimidating when I was getting started, because I would read interviews and I would watch interviews of other writers. And to a person, they're all like, "Oh, I was writing at 9 years old. I knew I was going to be a writer. I was reading books since I'm little. I read more than my parents." That wasn't me. I I discovered fiction in a real way when I was maybe 35. Before that, I read tons of nonfiction. I read tons of science, love astrophysics, love all of that. Of course, that helped me because when I wrote my space book, my bank was full, right? I came to it late. And so in a lot of ways, I made a lot of mistakes that lifelong readers wouldn't have made, lifelong readers of fiction. And I've had to play a lot of catch up. That's been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I had to learn a lot faster. Like my daughter right now, who's almost 10, her writing it's amazing because she reads constantly. She's read more books by age 9 than I read by the time I was 40. That's just a fact. She shreds them, a book a night. Okay. And I didn't have that when I started writing. I started from ground zero of like Googling, how do you write dialogue? Where does the comma go? Okay. That was like 2015. I'm doing that. But what I did have on my side was the determination of I'm going to write every day until I get better. And I did. I was writing thousands of words a day, and that has not stopped. That's been 9 years now. So I
Mhm.
really had to catch up. But to answer your question, that all comes back to this, which is my favorite adventure is actually meeting other writers now and being part of that world. It's just fascinating and so inspiring. And I did AuthorCon last year, which is in Williamsburg, Virginia. That's for horror writers, and then StokerCon, which is of course for horror writers. And those adventures have been amazing as far as just meeting all those wonderful, sweet people, sweet people. And then I did maybe accidentally crash a wedding suite and eat some of their food, but it wasn't on purpose. I was told afterwards, as I was telling some of my friends who were saying that they were hungry, and I said, "There's a con suite," and they went, "There's no con suite, Chris." And it turned out that I had stolen food unwittingly from a wedding, but they weren't in there, and it was just a couple of sandwiches, maybe also a cookie, maybe also some iced tea and lemonade. I made an Arnold Palmer, but it was all very innocent.
I love that story. That's great.
I'm turning red. I mean, I'm
Okay.
yeah.
So what is what is the greatest lesson that you've learned thus far in your writing career?
Uh, that with writing, like other skills, you can only get better. It's something I learned late in life. There were people telling me this, right? You always hear this, you just stop listening to it, about practice. Man, I do believe in the existence of talent. I think some people can throw a 100-mile-per-hour fastball. Some people can work their whole lives and never be able to do that. But with writing and with art, I don't necessarily believe that most of the successful people were born talented. I think they were born interested. And I think people who are born interested and find interests along the way and pursue them and just put in time, whether it's words at the keyboard or whether it's hours at the canvas or whatever it is, you can become a writer with enough time and enough effort and interest. You can become an artist with those same things. I have gone through that myself because, like I said, how old was I? I was 38 39 when I sat down to become a writer. I literally came home one day and just said, I had watched the movie Interstellar and I loved it so much. And I went and I bought Kip Thorne's book. He's the astrophysicist consultant. And I went and bought his book about the science of interstellar because they invented a black hole. And anyway, I read that and I went, people need to write books about space. Is anybody doing this? Right? And of course, I knew they were, but I was just like, I want to write a space book. And that's when I started Googling how to do dialogue. And a year later, I had a 98,000 word middle grade manuscript, not quite middle grade. And I had written my first book, started querying it, got some bites, passed by 80 or 90 agents. That's fine. Shelved it, wrote another one. By then I was hooked, but it was all hours. And I could look at what I had written several months earlier and go, wow, I've come a long way. And it's just hours. And so what I love most about it is that anyone can do it. It has nothing to do with talent. It doesn't. It's hours and interest. That's it.
Okay. So what piece of advice would you want to share with other writers? If that is that it, or do you have any more?
Yeah. So one other piece of advice I would give is I got very lucky when I was writing that very first middle grade book. And I found a blog by an agent named Janet Reed, Reid. And it's on Blogspot. So if you just Google that, I think it's janetreed.blogspot.com. And Janet probably posts on there, or at least she was back then, every day, and has hundreds, if not thousands, of posts about the industry, about publishing, about querying. She's also the agent that runs the website Query Shark, if anybody's heard of that. So if you're trying to query and trying to get an agent, she runs Query Shark as well, about refining and writing your queries. And so I happen to be I believe I've always had this like boneheaded belief that whatever I put my mind to, I can do. And sometimes that's gotten me into trouble because I've thought that what I've done is better than it is, right? And reading her blog every day, I would sit there with my coffee and I would read several posts And boy, did that put some truth in me about what it was going to take. And it really cleared the sky as far as here's how long this can take. Here's where you need to be in your game. Here's how you need to go about trying to achieve this goal. If this is a goal for you, for instance, in this case, traditional publishing. And so I had no illusions, right? I
Mhm.
had no illusions. I was like, this is going to take a long time. It's going to take as long as it takes. I love the process of creating. So I'm going to try as hard as I can not to be impatient. That didn't mean that I didn't walk around in a cloud of desperation. I still did. It was all I wanted, right? But still, I reminded myself that blog, reading that blog, was a total check on me not going absolutely nuts in this process. So my advice would be Janet gives you some real reality on what to expect if you're a aspiring writer. And it was huge for me to keep me in check in so many ways because left to my own devices, I could probably do a lot of damage to my own chances for success. So it was a great check on me.
Okay, great. So, were there any groups, clubs, or organizations that you would recommend to other writers that may have helped you in your career?
Um, so I am a member of, the science fiction. Well, I guess now it's different, but SFWA, Science Fiction
Mhm.
Writers Association, but that includes fantasy and horror, um, and the Horror Writers Association. But you have to already have publications to get into those. So they're great to be a part of, and they do have a lot of great resources. And they do offer different things to folks who are brand new. Um, but I was already published by the time that I applied to them. I would say the most important thing was I got on social media, and whether it was Twitter for the most part, um, but also some Facebook and things. And there are different readers and writers groups, and it was people first before it was associations
Mhm.
or official groups that I would write for a flash fiction contest, and I would see the other people who were writing for it. I would go read their stuff, and then I might, retweet their stuff or talk about their stuff. And sometimes we might make a connection and start talking to each other. And then before long, we're sending each other our work. And that network, I would say a network of other writers is the single most important thing. And you build it from the ground up. If it's one or two people to start, which it was for me for several years,
Mhm.
great. And then you build out that network. And I'm telling you, you keep at it before too long, you have to start really thinking about, wow, do I share it with everybody or do I just pick a few? Because then you know so many more people and you know what each of them can give you as far as feedback on your work, and then they come to you on their work as well. So a network of other writers is the most important thing. I think
Okay.
that I think that official groups and everything is secondary to that.
Okay, great. Okay, now I have a couple of questions about you as a person. And we kind of have to speed it up a little because
Sure.
we've gone about an hour.
Got it.
So, excuse me. What is one thing that most people don't realize about you?
Well, especially when we meet at conventions and stuff and all of that, I'm usually in my hoodie and I'm covered in tattoos and stuff. They don't realize that I'm a lawyer, and I don't need them to know. I don't need them to know that. I don't go around acting like a lawyer. I've got a creative side too, and that's the side that I'm sort of leaning into now.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah.
Okay. So what is or are your passions when you're not writing?
I do a lot of gardening. I would call it sort of just trial and error gardening. I'm currently tilling up part of my yard to plant Texas blackland prairie, which is native prairie in my front yard. We'll see if the city lets me do it. Um, I became a bird watcher. I got a bunch of bird feeders out here over the pandemic. Old man bird watcher already. And what else? And I have been practicing Brazilian Jiu Jitsu for about a year, and I absolutely love it. So Brazilian
Brazilian.
Jiu Jitsu,
Oh, jujitsu.
the martial
Ah,
art, and
excellent.
then And then, I mean, my single favorite thing in the whole world is spending time with my daughter. So that's what we
Wonderful.
do. And it's so funny. We're such a homebody family, my wife and my daughter and I, because we just love being with each other. We probably need to get out more, but spend a lot of time with each other at home.
Oh, that's great. By the way, bird watching is not, excuse me, is not just an old person thing. It's a great hobby,
Oh
and there's
man.
so many people love to watch
I
birds.
mean,
It's
over the pandemic, here's my monocular
aha,
right by the
yes,
window.
it's a great thing.
That's the best.
Um, okay, and what while you're writing, what does your writing space look like, and what do you need to have with you when you're writing or editing?
Luckily, I don't have to have the candle and and all of that stuff. I can write anywhere, really. I'm very fortunate in that way that I can kind of dial in and dive right back in. I do a lot of writing at coffee shops. I coffee shop hop and right there I can write with a little bit of noise or some music that doesn't have any lyrics. Um, and if I've got some coffee, I'm good. That's really it. So if I've got my computer and some coffee, I'm set.
All right, that sounds great. Writers often have furry or feathered or otherwise non-human companions to help them through their work. And do they help you? Do you have any, and do they help you or hinder you?
Well, we have two dogs, and they provide companionship. I've got one right over there on that chair. That's Gretel. She's sleeping on that chair over there. And so she's always in here. So I've got my little companion, and we pet on each other, and she'll come over and muzzle punch me and tell me she wants some pets. But other than that, it's nice to have her around. But so she's the main one, and I've got another dog named Samson.
Ah, great. Um, Now, where my last two questions are: where
Mhm.
can people find your work aside from Annie's Bookstop of Worcester? And I have to give a plug for Annie's. Excuse me, I'm losing my voice here. Um, I have to give a plug for Annie's, uh, and you can you can get Chris's books by calling us at 508-796-5613, and we can get them for you, or you can send us email at orders@anniesbooksworcester.com. And where else can people find your books?
They are available really anywhere. Any of the obviously the big websites, Amazon or Barnes and Noble, um, uh, bookshop.org. A lot of but most, just like Annie's, most smaller bookstores will order anything for you. And so I definitely prefer that people do that if they can. I know it's not always the most convenient, but it means a lot to the smaller bookstores, and small bookstores are the best. And if I get up to Boston, I'm coming to Worcester. I'm going to Annie's.
Good,
Um,
great, thank you.
I will let you know. I will let you know ahead of time. We actually might come to Boston this summer, so I'll reach out to you. But
Definitely.
yeah, so that's the best place. You just search my name or search the books, and my website is chrispanatiere.com. Everything's there. It's got all the social media links too. I'm not shy on the internet. I'm easy to find.
Okay, great. That was my second question, is how can we follow your work and share your awesomeness? So,
Oh, well, that's very sweet. I think probably the best place is the website. But I'm pretty active on Twitter, which is just Chris J Panatiere, at Chris J Panatiere, and Instagram at Chris Panatiere.
great. Chris Panatiere, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. This was a great conversation, and I know I was a little verbose, so sorry about that.
No, it was fine. You gave us some great information.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much.